So let's kick off Halloween season with a few games that aren't really scary, but are maybe spooky adjacent. We'll save the actually spooky stuff for later in October, both because I like to ease us into haunt season, and also because it's 2020, and honestly, I don't know what kind of appetite there is for willingly consuming even more nightmares, so yeah. Anyway, to start, let's talk about a video game about necromancy and the dead, Necrobarista. Necrobarista is a visual novel released earlier this year by Route 59 Games. It's the story of Maddie, a necromancer in training who owns and operates The Terminal, a coffee house that serves as something of a halfway house between the living and the dead. The recently deceased can stop in for up to 24 hours, but after that they really need to move on to, well, whatever comes next. Helping Maddie out is Che, her necromancy teacher and former owner of The Terminal, and Ashley, a young inventor girl with a penchant for caffeine and throwing knives. The game follows 3 pivotal days for the Terminal's staff as the Council, which oversees magic and ensures the balance of life and death is kept, sends its agent Ned to deal with the violations of magical law that forbid necromancy, as well as the Terminal's mounting debt. See, the currency of the dead is hours in this plane, and Maddie and friends have racked up thousands of hours in the red that need to be accounted for. Meanwhile, a new customer, Kishan, comes in after his untimely demise to process what happened to him while helping out around the cafe. And Necrobarista occupies a really interesting space in the visual novel genre. Alex over at First 5, who you should check out if you like talking about smaller games like this, did a whole spiel on how it uses its camera to effectively build shots, making it something of a cross between traditional visual novels and Telltale's more animated approach, but with a much bigger emphasis on cinematography than either of them.
Necrobarista can draw comparisons with a lot of different narrative lineages in the gaming medium, but it doesn't quite belong to any one of them. There isn't much out there that's gonna hit quite like Necrobarista, where you're sitting there listening to characters making incredibly online millennial jokes, and then all of a sudden you just get hit by a beautiful shot like this.
And I think that's true, but really, more than anything, the vibe I got from this game is a 2000s era webcomic. First, because there's no voice work and the emphasis on giving each shot its own carefully chosen framing makes it feel like it could be a frame from a comic book, but also because of the tone of the writing. There's a lot of disaffected snark here. And also, everyone works at a coffee shop, and there are all these ridiculous anime touches. Ashley has a robot arm and invents little sentient robots, and Che is a hundreds-year-old necromancer. But the game's more interested in their day-to-day lives than in these fantastical gimmicks. It's very much slice-of-life stuff, debt and day jobs more than magical spells and undead monsters. I feel like it's less like Telltale games or visual novels than Jeff Jack's questionable content. Or maybe more like questionable content by way of Telltale games and visual novels. The point is, it's a unique thing to experience effectively a 3D webcomic, a sort of machinima megatokyo. It just put me in a headspace I haven't been in since the mid-2000s, and that's weird. But good weird. I also love how Australian the game is. Route 59 is based in Melbourne, and a lot of that comes through in the game. There's Australian slang and references to local districts and other Australian cities. Thankfully, a lot of them are annotated to help explain to the uninformed. The character of Ned is actually Ned Kelly, the famed bushranger who donned armor in his final stand against the police. It is a very Australian game, and it gives Necrobarista a very specific sense of place and character and history. Which is good because it can take all it can get. The one criticism I have is that it feels like the budget for the game ran out in the middle of production. In between acts, the game lets you walk around in first person and unlock little optional side stories that flesh out the characters and universe, but it feels like they range from supplemental world building to entirely cut chapters. There's an act in the middle of the game that introduces 3 characters that appear nowhere else but the little unlockable vignettes, and I think they were supposed to appear more frequently in the main game, but they just don't. And while the ending does clean up most loose threads, it also feels like it was compelled to just sort of wrap everything up ASAP. There's some contrivances that make everything a little too neat, but I won't spoil them here. Still, I enjoyed my time with it. Necrobarista is a game about death and change, but specifically a game about impending death and change. A game about what to do when you know you have a set amount of time left as things are, and maybe you can stretch it out a little bit further, but you can see and feel the end coming. How do you make peace with that? How do you deal with life itself becoming a tangibly liminal state? We are forced to walk away from one another in the middle of each other's stories, both because of death and just because of life stuff happening. And having to face that kinda sucks, and is what the game is about. And so it's interesting to me that the game's primary mechanic is forcing players to pace the story. Because you click to continue to the next panel, and the pace of these events is kind of up to you. Just as Keyshawn has to decide how long to stay in this plane before moving on, so too do players decide just how long to hold on one shot or moment before moving on to the next. And sometimes it feels critically important to do so, to hang on a sunset, or emotional exclamation, or isolating framing. In some ways, I feel like this whole game is an exploration of that one perfect morning in Life is Strange, where Max wakes up next to Chloe, and you can kind of just hang out in that moment for a little while.
I can feel it when we kiss. So many men stronger than me have thrown their backs out.
Forward movement is inevitable. The end of things as they are here, now, in this moment is inevitable. But you can linger in a moment. Make it stretch. The way it deals with its subject matter isn't perfect. The game does switch between its sardonic comedy and anime hijinks and into its more maudlin and introspective bits a bit abruptly. The music changes on a dime when it decides to get serious, and that can be jarring. But all the same, I found it surprisingly affecting. It might be because I'm dealing with some similar issues in my own life right now, or it might be because I have a soft spot for a cheesy internet snark of Days Gone By, but I really appreciated how Necrobarista managed to address the way loss happens without becoming too morose or too heavy. If anything, the flippant tone and magical realism help remove the weightiness of the game being literally about death. It's not a grand treatise on the cessation of consciousness and life itself. It's a small story about how we face changes in our lives that we don't want to or aren't ready for. And for a 4-hour visual novel, I got a lot out of that. Cloud Gardens is a post-apocalyptic gardening game. In it, you're presented with little dioramas, some fence work on the side of the road, a parking lot, a cell phone tower, and are tasked with building a scene straight out of The Last of Us, where nature has come to reclaim these little slices of a now absent humanity. To that end, you can place seeds for different kinds of plants. Some grow up out of the ground, like cacti and ferns, others grow like vines across vertical surfaces. But placing the seeds alone doesn't do much. In order for them to grow, you need to decorate the scene, with each prop you place emitting a small sphere of influence that causes the plants next to it to grow. The bigger the prop, the bigger the influence. Major road signs and RV trailers can reach almost all vegetation in the scene, where a beer can or lunchbox might only have influence of a few feet. Once you've grown enough vegetation, the scene is complete, and you can move on to the next one. Viewed from one angle, Cloud Gardens is surprisingly gamey. It's very much possible to fail a diorama if you don't plan how you're going to use your plants. Each scene starts with only a few seeds, and to unlock more you need to collect the fruit that germinates once plants reach maturity. And you only have but so many props to make plants grow, so it's critical to ensure that you maximize the number of plants touched with each prop by accounting for the plant's proximity and the size of the prop, as well as making sure to use your seeds as soon as you unlock them. In a sense, Cloud Gardens is something of a turn-based puzzle game, except the puzzles have dozens of answers and often offer more resources than you need to solve them. Still, I have had to restart a level or two when I got props I wasn't expecting that I really needed to plan for, or forgot to make use of my seeds until the end when there wasn't enough props left for them to grow. The real point of the game is to effectively just work with the plant growth algorithm and the game systems to build a post-apocalyptic diorama. It's not purely an expressive endeavor, and if that's what you're expecting, it can be a little frustrating at first. Early on, all you can do is build road signs, for example, and it can be irksome to have to place signs in weird places because you need to focus on plant growth. But the end result is a giant road sign covered in plants that's unreadable anyways, so having some signs on the wrong side of the scaffolding really isn't that big of a deal. Indeed, the point of the game is that the purpose of the stuff mankind built doesn't matter anymore, and now exists for the plants, not for the people. And besides, once you start getting into bigger dioramas and mixing wall-hugging vines with ground-growing plants, placement starts to feel a smidge more natural. But while there are some surprisingly engaging systems here, the game is incredibly relaxing. Once you get the rhythm down of using your seeds as you unlock them and doing a little bit of planning ahead of time, you can just fall into the act of caring for your little garden. It takes effort, but it isn't hard or cruel, and the outcomes are undeniably both beautiful and soothing. Even if a prop you place accidentally knocks out some plant growth, if possible it will attempt to regrow to its previous size using the new geometry. You can still lose progress with a particularly bad prop placement, but it doesn't feel punitive. It's just the algorithm literally not having the room to grow back. Several dioramas also kind of nudge you to create pre-baked environmental narratives. A desert bath with candles everywhere, or a fortified Old West entryway. There's a scene that gives you 2 chairs and a few beer bottles that turns out to be up on a highway column. Was it a sniper post? A lookout for a village? The last stand of 2 friends? The game doesn't say, but invites you to think about it as you place the chairs and beer bottles and radios and cars that surround them. Then watch as plants consume all of it. To round out the package, there's a photo mode that allows you to both take photos and also export a time-lapse of the growth of your little diorama, and completing each level unlocks props for use in a creative mode. So if you do want to handcraft your own environmental storytelling about people that were but are no more without worrying about growing enough plants, you're free to do so. Cloud Gardens is still in early access and only has about half of the levels it intends to finally ship with, but I think if it interests you, it's worth playing now. It's just got this beautiful tone that is at once relaxing, somber, and a little sad, but also hopeful. Even in the face of the end of the world, life goes on. Crows caw and flowers bloom as the last of what was is reclaimed. And maybe it's just the 2020 talking, but wistfully looking back on humanity's remains while helping the plants take everything back is exactly what I needed to play recently. Now that we've done a calm, relaxing title, let's shift gears entirely to the extreme opposite. Oh, and before we start, strobe warning for those sensitive to such things. Skip to this timestamp or go to the next chapter to avoid it. This game is very into flashing lights. Anyways, Post-Void. You are a person? Entity? Who enjoyed what was effectively a peaceful non-existence in the Void. But then came a massive headache that destroyed the serenity of the Void, and you desperately longed to be rid of it. Mystical idol in hand, you set off through this new Post-Void in an attempt to restore your peace and a sense of hopefulness. Rock Paper Shotgun's Sin Vega described it as an FPS that feels like Devil Daggers had a fever dream about Hotline Miami while drowning in a vat of caffeine, and that more or less sums it up. Like Devil Daggers, it's a first-person shooter all about aiming for a high score. But unlike Devil Daggers, you're running through procedurally generated levels as fast as you possibly can, stopping only to maybe adjust your aim before moving on to the next room. See, the idol you carry is constantly draining liquid. On top of that, taking damage eats away at the liquid. If the idol runs out of liquid, you die. And the only way to refill that liquid is either by killing enemies or by reaching the end of the level. The result is a game that thrives on generating tension and stress as it funnels you down corridors where you either need to resolve conflicts ASAP or decide to skip them entirely. There's a constant pressure to keep heading closer to the exit, but also a need to shoot enemies if possible to replenish the idol. The game's levels are effectively a series of micro-encounters, short bouts of conflict that last 5 to 10 seconds and often less. It's like you're playing Wolfenstein 3D at 5 times speed while still trying to beat par on the level times. The conflict is shallow, but the rapid pace of everything just makes it feel super intense. The speed of movement is constant, not just your movement, but the undulating geometry of the levels and the way the wallpaper is animated to have that squiggle vision look, and how most of the user interface wiggles or changes shape or blinks. The entire design just embodies anxiety. The whole game has a sort of bad drug trip feel about it, up to and including the monster design. Men in suits with Langoliers for heads who shoot at you for reasons unknown, many tentacled monsters with no eyes but rows of sharp teeth, mechanical manhack drones, wall-mounted tentacles that shoot at you with their eyes, giant men blocking hallways like they had an accident with mushrooms from Wonderland. I've seen Steam reviews compare the game to Dorohedoro, but I don't watch much anime and I don't really know what that means. To an old like me, it reminds me of early MTV animated programs like Aeon Flux or Liquid Television. There's an ugliness to the aesthetic. Just look at that hand holding the idol. But it feels not just intentionally off-putting, but even somehow striking. It's boldly ugly, and I kind of dig it. And it sounds like I'm describing this horrible, trippy, hideous, intense experience, but that's kind of what I love about it all. Sometimes I want a game to remind me that I'm alive, a game to get my heart pumping and my adrenaline up, and the short nature of its runs means that it never feels overwhelming. It's not a 10-hour anxiety and stress marathon. It's a roguelike where a lot of runs only last 2 to 5 minutes. It ends up being a game like Super Hexagon or, yeah, Devil Daggers, titles with brief, intense runs for high scores that I never spend an entire evening playing, but that I find perfectly suited for when you need to occupy your brain intensely for a bit. It boils first-person shooters down to a constant engagement with fight-or-flight instincts, and losing myself in that panic for a little while can be cathartic in its own way. So I know that Spelunky 2 just came out and everyone's real excited for that, but Spelunky is also cute as a button and that's not very Halloween-y. You know what's more Halloween-y? Weird body horror nightmares and human sacrifice. Spirit's Abyss is the latest release from Anthony Case, who actually has a fairly extensive history of making different kinds of roguelikes. There's Skelly Celeste, a top-down action roguelike where you are a skeleton fighting demonic hordes. And then there's Stramium Immortally, a roguelike shmup where you clear rooms full of horrible monsters. It's very hard. And all of these games have their very own mechanical quirks and influences, but each also very much feels like the work of the same mind. They all have this sort of psychedelic aesthetic with neon color changing graphics and monstrous character and enemy designs, like Jeff Minter and Rob Zombie decided to make a game together. Which does sound really cool. In Spirit's Abyss, you are a small child thrown from a cliff in the hopes that you can find your way through the haunted caverns below and come out the other end with riches in tow. It's Spelunky. It's procedurally generated levels where you start at the top and work your way downward while avoiding monsters and using bombs to either change the environment or clear a path, all while collecting gold and diamonds. It's Spelunky. But, okay, it's not just a reskin of Spelunky, though it's certainly playing in the same sandbox. First of all, like a lot of Case's other titles, Spirit's Abyss has multiple playable classes. These classes have different attacks and ways of using their bombs. One character uses a katana and throws bombs in a way that feels perhaps the most Spelunky-y. But other characters fire pistols and have bombs that detonate on impact. And another character has something like a magical staff that shoots many pellets like a shotgun, whose bombs go in a straight line for a certain distance and then explode whether they hit something or not, kinda like a rocket. With this class-based approach, there's a move away from Spelunky's focus on rigidly systems-driven emergent traps. You basically never find yourself carrying bodies to throw below you so you trigger the trap and don't have to hit it, for example. And instead the game reframes around combat. Especially when playing as characters with ranged weapons, enemies take a lot of hits to defeat and can throw any number of projectiles at you. You also tend to have a lot more bombs on hand than in Spelunky, because the idea is that you use them as a weapon as much as a navigational tool. So Spirit's Abyss is very Spelunky-y, but like action Spelunky, combat Spelunky. The lo-fi pixel art also lets the game do a lot of weird one-off things. Like Spelunky, sometimes you'll get a variation on a given level. The starter level has a frozen ice variant and a purple cursed variant, for example. Each level also has its own gimmicks and secrets, from teleporters and bomb machines to faceless golems that can repair equipment to gambling tables. And not just each level, but in between levels too. Usually you'll fall from a level, hit the upgrade screen, and then move on to the next level, but sometimes you'll see these hints that point to unlockable characters, secret boss fights, and other surprises. I'm kind of mixed on this, actually. On one hand, it makes the game feel like it has tons of untold secrets. I've only unlocked half the characters, and I only have a vague idea on how to get the others, and I love it when a game doesn't feel like I could just game FAQ my way through it. Games with secrets are cool. On the other hand, since you can't really control what scenes you get in between levels, I sometimes have to decide, do I want to give up my run and try to unlock that character by doing that really hard boss fight right now, because who knows when I'll get the chance again, or do I want to keep hoarding points for a possible high score? It's a minor thing, but it's probably my biggest complaint I've had while playing it. Well, that and how often I try to gently plant a bomb at my feet before forgetting that I'm playing a character whose bombs instantly go off on contact. The game has all the modes you'd expect, seeded weekly runs, survival mode, leaderboards for each character, etc., and some you might not, like a whole combat card game based on the cards you collect of fallen enemies. Also, I really need to point out that Spirit's Abyss just has some really astoundingly kickin' music. So yeah, it's content rich, it has a ton of unlockable stuff, and if you're in the mood for a more Halloween-adjacent Spelunky title, well, it's really hard to do better than this. The last game we'll be looking at today is Fatum Betula. The name is Latin for Birch of Fate, which is more or less the core premise. The player awakens in some sort of sanctum, where, at the top of a flight of stairs, a tree sits suspended in air, its roots stretching down to barely scrape the water below. A scary manifestation materializes, and asks you to choose how to care for the tree, choosing which waters it should drink from. But also be warned, for the choice of how to water the Tree of Fate will decide the outcome of the universe itself. Fatum Betula is one of those collect the endings games, where it's less about the core systems or narrative arcs than seeing all the different ways the story can go. There are 10 different endings, and all of them stem from what liquids you choose to pour into the waters that feed the Tree of Fate. Some of them are silly, like what happens when you pour in liquid bone. Others range from melancholy to outright dark, but I'll let you find those out for yourselves. In order to get those endings, you'll play what is effectively a first-person adventure title. There are characters who have problems, and it's your job to solve them. This might mean finding an item elsewhere in the world, or it might mean using an item you got from another character. As you progress, you'll run into different substances, some of which are necessary to solve other people's problems or reach other areas, but each of which can be placed into the aquifer that feeds the Fatum Betula and generate a different destiny for the world. Fatum Betula originally appeared as part of the Haunted PS1 demo disc project, a collection of horror vignettes paying tribute to late 90s and early 2000s horror games. Its PSX roots run deep, and while I haven't been able to confirm it, the general consensus around the internet is that the game is inspired, at least in part, by the 1998 PS1 game LSD Dream Emulator. Like LSD, it's a trip into a surreal dream world full of FMV clips, exploration of low-fidelity spaces, and a tone that mixes the uncomfortably chipper with the grimly dark until you're not even sure that the happy bits are truly happy. But unlike LSD, it's more structured. Again, this is more about finding pre-chosen endings and simply experiencing semi-procedural spaces. The game's notable in part to me because the developer is all of 19 years old. God, when I was 19, I was making really bad Quake mods. And I find that interesting not just because it's a pretty impressive effort from someone that young, but that it embraces this specific early 3D aesthetic so strongly. Not just low poly, low texture assets, but keeping the game in 4:3 and even having a user interface that feels very much of that time period. It's a game that's nostalgic for an era its developer didn't experience until after it had passed, and I find that fascinating. I also think Fatum Betula is a really good game to end on as we head towards Halloween season. It isn't expressly a horror game, but unlike the other games we've looked at here today, it certainly aims to be intentionally creepy. It's the sort of game where you go to bed and wake up in a glitchy dream world haunted by the ghosts of local fishermen. It's the sort of game where the blackest depths of the ocean hold a 1950s sitcom reality where every house is the same. It's a game where immortality exists, but that doesn't stop you from turning into a skeleton and just getting bored. None of this is jump scares and dread, but it is off-putting, creepy, discomforting. And heading into Halloween season, it's fun to have a little appetizer of what's to come. So play some of these not-so-spooky games, because next time we won't be so soft. I'll see you then.